Greetings, dear listeners. From where do you join us this evening, seeking a quiet harbor in the turning of the night? Let us travel far back, past the edge of memory, to a time when the world was woven not by iron or parchment, but by the deep roots of the ancient oaks, where the air itself hummed with unspoken knowledge. Draw close, and let the gentle rhythm of the Druid's path lull your spirit. For tonight we speak of the Nemeton, the sacred heart of the Celtic lands, where the trees were the highest temples and the stones held the oldest prayers. This is the realm where wisdom was measured not in seasons, but in the lifetimes of the forest's ancient protectors, who guarded the boundary between the mortal realm and the unseen currents of the deep earth. The morning mist clung low to the valley floor, a pale, milky shroud that muffled all but the softest footfall, ensuring that only those meant to find the sacred grove, the Nemeton, could truly approach it. Here, the air was cool and sweet, scented heavily with decaying leaves and the sharp, clean spice of pine, a fragrance that marked the threshold where human concerns dissolved into the eternal quietude of the forest spirit. Within this hallowed circle stood trees of prodigious age, their trunks covered in thick, furrowed bark that seemed less like wood and more like living granite. Silent monuments to the passage of countless ages, their massive branches intertwined above to form a dense canopy that rarely permitted the careless gaze of the midday sun. It was said that the light filtering through these leaves held the memory of the land itself, dappling the mossy ground in shifting patterns of green and gold, providing a perfect stillness for contemplation. Among these giants walked Lugan, a young druid whose years of study had been spent mastering the intricate verses of cosmology and the complex patterns of the stars, learning the secrets of herba lore and the hidden power contained within the simplest stream. His teacher, the elder Cathbad, had long insisted that true understanding lay not in the recitation of knowledge, but in the listening to the unspoken language of the earth, urging Lugan to seek the silence that existed deeper than mere absence of sound. Lugan was burdened now by a great curiosity. He understood the outer forms of the rituals, the timing of the moon's cycles, and the proper offerings for the earth deities, but he longed to grasp the profound, seamless connection between the three spheres: Unwin, the deep underworld; Abred, the mortal life; and Gwynvid, the ultimate peace. He sought the single, immutable law that governed all flow and stillness. Cathbad had sent him to the deepest part of the grove, a place named for the standing stones that marked the boundary of the deepest slumber, instructing him to remain until he learned what the stones had witnessed and what the great central oak withheld. The elder had told him, "The forest speaks in the language of growth and decay, Luhan, and the greatest truths are carved not upon stone, but within the slow pulse of the hardwood." The young man carried only a rough woolen cloak, a leather satchel containing nothing but dried moss and flint, and his own focused intent, knowing that the greatest journey was always inward, requiring patience beyond mortal measure. He had already spent 3 days observing the patterns of the nesting ravens and tracing the barely visible runes of the Ogham script carved by generations past into the smooth surfaces of fallen slate. He finally reached the heart of the Nemeton, a small clearing dominated by a single, colossal oak tree whose root system was so vast it appeared to be holding the entire forest floor in a gentle, firm embrace. This tree, named Derry, was rumored to have been ancient when the ancestors first arrived in this land, its lowest branches resting heavily on the damp ground, providing shelter for wild deer and quiet shelter for the traveling spirits. Lugan sat with his back pressed against the rough, cold bark, feeling the slow, constant vibration of the living wood, a rhythm entirely unlike the quick beat of his own heart or the rush of the wind through the upper canopy. He closed his eyes, consciously slowing his breath until it matched the deliberate, glacial pace of the tree's life, striving to become a mere extension of its massive structure. The first night was filled with distracting sounds. The nervous scampering of a shrew in the undergrowth, the distant, mournful cry of an owl hunting, and the unsettling snap of a small branch succumbing to age. Lugon found himself counting the moments, fighting the urge to stand, and cataloging every external stimulus, which only served to emphasize the chaotic nature of the surface world he had left behind. He realized that even in the absence of human speech, the forest was overwhelmingly loud, a constant symphony of small, persistent struggles for existence, a beautiful violence that contradicted the silence Cathbad had spoken of. He spent the entire duration of the moon's traverse across the black sky in this struggle, failing to penetrate the surface noise and reach the core stillness. When the fourth dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in delicate shades of pearl and rose, Lugon felt the cold stiffness of exhaustion settle deep into his bones, and a deep frustration began to gnaw at his concentration. He opened his eyes and looked not up toward the sky, but down at the infinitesimal layer of soil and moss immediately surrounding the oak's base, examining the tiny, vibrant world thriving just beneath his gaze. He watched a minuscule procession of ants carrying minute fragments of wood, each insect utterly devoted to its small, essential task, oblivious to the grandeur of the millennia-old trunk towering above it. He observed the droplets of dew clinging perfectly to the intricate lace of a spider's web, reflecting the whole world upside down in their perfect, brief spheres. In that focused, meticulous attention to the miniature, Lugon perceived the underlying truth that transcended the audible chaos. Every single creature, every falling leaf, every drop of moisture was moving in perfect, unwavering obedience to an internal, eternal mandate. The tree did not strive to grow, it simply grew, stretching its roots deeper not out of ambition, but out of necessity and innate being. The silence Cathbad had described was not a lack of sound, but the perfect harmony achieved when every single element of existence is fulfilling its destiny without resistance or doubt, forming an unbroken cycle of consumption and creation. This was the deep, patient language of the Nemeton, the collective sigh of a billion lifetimes simply being. He remembered the lessons of the eternal yew tree that marked the oldest boundary of the settlement, a tree whose dark, poisonous sap made it shunned by men yet revered by Druids for its extraordinary longevity and the paradox of its nature. The yew embodied both death and profound, unyielding life simultaneously, often growing for centuries after its heartwood had rotted away, replacing itself from within, a continuous rebirth. Lugon understood then that the great truth was that Anun, Abred, and Gwynvid were not separate destinations to be achieved, but interlocking states of the same eternal existence, just as the yew held both the shadow of the grave and the green promise of endless renewal within its tough, ancient fiber. When Luhan finally stood, the stiffness in his limbs was forgotten, replaced by a quiet, vibrating energy that flowed from the earth up through his feet. He reached out and placed his hand upon the bark of Derry, the great oak, and felt not just the presence of a tree, but the silent, immense weight of time itself resting there, utterly at peace. The sacred text of the Nemeton was not something to be recited or memorized, but a condition to be attained. The profound calm that comes from knowing one's place in the immense, slow unfolding of existence, recognizing that even the greatest storm is merely a fleeting breath in the thousand-year history of the forest. He bowed deeply to the tree and to the standing stones, now understanding that they were not merely markers, but silent listeners, holding the echo of every word ever spoken in the grove, patiently awaiting the return of perfect stillness. He left the deepest clearing as the sun fully rose, flooding the eastern side of the grove with warm, palpable light that sliced through the remaining wisps of mist, illuminating the dusty gold of the pollen drifting through the air. The path he took back felt different now. Where before he had noticed obstacles, protruding roots and scattered stones, now he saw only the intentional placement of the forest floor, each part essential to the flow of water and the sustenance of the soil. The world had not changed, but Lugan's perception had deepened, allowing him to perceive the magnificent, silent rhythm that underpinned all of nature's apparent chaos, realizing that the Nemeton was not just a grove, but a mirror reflecting the disciplined and eternal heart of the cosmos. Returning to Cathbad, Lufon offered no grand pronouncements or detailed cosmological explanations, but merely sat in respectful silence, allowing the stillness he had found in the heartwood to settle around them both. The elder druid did not ask what wisdom Lufon had gained, for he saw the answer reflected in the profound calm of the young man's eyes and the slow, deliberate manner in which he moved, finally attuned to the measured tempo of the ancient earth. Cathbad simply nodded, knowing that Lufon had stepped beyond the knowledge of songs and scripts and had finally begun to learn the true, silent language of the gods, which is spoken only in the deep roots of the forest. This ultimate lesson was the merging of self with the vast, patient Nemeton, becoming a vessel for the eternal cycle rather than merely an observer of it. For the rest of his life, Lugan carried the weight and silence of the great oak within him, moving through the world with the measured pace of a root seeking water, never hurried, never distracted by the fleeting clamor of mortal concerns. When he spoke the ancient incantations during the great festivals of Samhain and Beltane, his voice was not loud but resonant, imbued with the deep timbre of the earth, echoing the slow, undeniable power he had witnessed in the Nemeton. His presence alone brought a quality of deep peace, reminding all those who sought his counsel that the truest sanctuary was not a place built by human hands, but the constant, quiet devotion to the pulse of life that flowed through every living thing. And so, we leave Luhan in the company of the ancient trees, where the forest continues its silent, sacred work, teaching the wisdom of patience and the acceptance of time's slow current. The Nemeton remains, even now, a quiet promise that if we simply cease our striving and listen deeply enough, we too can hear the Earth's measured heartbeat and find our own perfect stillness within the great cosmic dance. Sleep now, and may the silence of the old gods settle softly upon your spirit. The cycle of the seasons turns slowly over the Nemeton, each shift in light and temperature adding another layer of silent history to the colossal trunks of the sacred oaks, which were perpetually draped in velvet moss and the pale, resilient tendrils of ivy. Luhan, now a respected leader among the Druids, had taken to performing the most intricate ceremonies deep within the grove during the darkest hours of the winter solstice, utilizing the profound darkness as a means to perceive the faintest, burgeoning light of renewal hidden within the sleeping world. He understood that the forest did not merely endure the winter. It used the cold silence as a necessary period of deep withdrawal, conserving the vital energies for the explosive resurgence of spring, teaching that true strength lay in disciplined restraint. He often brought his own students to the standing stones, not to lecture them on ancient history or arcane formulae, but to instruct them in the art of waiting, the passive, watchful state of mind that allowed the forest to reveal its own truths, uncolored by human expectation. Lugan would urge them to press their hands against the cold, granite surfaces of the megaliths, feeling the subtle temperature variation caused by the slight movements of the earth, asking them to discern the memory of the rain that had fallen 100 years past, or the echo of the thunder that had split a neighboring branch centuries ago. He taught that the stones, being of the earth, shared the same slow, timeless perspective as the oldest trees, acting as silent reservoirs of geological wisdom. One of Lugan's most promising students, a young man named Brennus, struggled with the philosophical implications of unwind, the deep underworld, fearing it as a place of absolute void and dissolution, unable to reconcile it with the vibrancy of the surface world. Lugan led him to a patch of rich, black soil beneath a fallen elder tree, whose pale wood was already softening and crumbling into fertile dust, encouraging Brennus to sift the cool soil through his fingers. He explained that the underworld was not empty, but the teeming matrix of all potential life, the vast digestive realm where old forms were broken down into the elemental components necessary for new life to spring forth, turning death into the ultimate act of giving. "Look closely at this soil, Brennus," Luhan instructed softly, his voice barely disturbing the quiet air. "It holds the memory of every oak leaf and every badger that has lived and died here for 1,000 years. Unwin is the deepest root, the great recycler, the promise that nothing is truly lost, merely transformed into the possibility of glorious future growth." He knelt beside the student, pointing out the fragile white filaments of mycelium weaving through the dirt, a hidden, silent network that connected every tree and every living thing in the grove, showing the student the physical reality of the interconnected spiritual web. Brennus spent the rest of that day tracing the growth patterns of the fungi, understanding the deep, hidden commerce of the forest floor, where decay was merely the preparation for abundance. He realized that the nemeton was not simply a collection of standing entities, but a vast, slow-breathing organism, where the visible trees were only the sun-catching organs of a greater, unseen body rooted in the darkness. His fear of the underworld dissolved, replaced by a deep reverence for the necessary balance of shadow and light, realizing that the strongest parts of existence were always those unseen, those operating quietly beneath the surface. The Druids held their most important councils under the broad canopy of Derry, the ancient oak, using the perfect acoustic stillness of the clearing to ensure that every spoken word carried its full weight and sincerity. These councils rarely involved passionate debate. Rather, they were long periods of contemplative silence, punctuated by careful, measured statements that summarized the wisdom gathered over months of lonely observation across the wider territory. Lugan often presided, guiding the rhythm of the meeting by the subtle shifting of his posture, ensuring that the human rhythm mirrored the slow, steady rhythm of the nemeton itself. It was during one such summer council, when the heat haze shimmered over the distant hills and the forest was drowsy with the buzzing of bees, that a messenger arrived from the distant settlements, bringing news of encroaching threat. The Roman legions were pressing closer, their iron boots shattering the natural silence of the borderlands. The Druids listened with unperturbed stillness, their faces showing no visible alarm, for they understood that human empires were like the brief annual growth of fragile ivy, while the forest, the true empire, endured through millennia. They looked to Lugan, seeking not a strategy of battle, but a spiritual perspective on this disruption. They looked to Lugan, seeking not a strategy of battle, but a spiritual perspective on this disruption. Lugan stood slowly, his shadow long and thin in the late afternoon light, and spoke only a few sentences, drawing on the deepest lesson of the oak. The axe finds the wood, but the root remains. We cannot prevent the season of fire, but we can ensure that the memory of the nemeton remains protected, tucked deep within the unwritten heart of our people. He decreed that their primary duty was to deepen the spiritual connection of the people to the land, ensuring that even if the physical groves were burned, the sacred knowledge would live on, carried by the slow, inexorable current of ancestral memory. They began the long, patient process of encoding their most sacred verses not into physical artifacts that could be destroyed, but into the structure of music and the rhythm of the year's labor, embedding deep philosophical truths within the planting songs and the harvesting chants. This spiritual dispersal was the ultimate act of trust in the enduring power of the Nemeton, transforming the entire land into one vast living temple, where every field and every stream held a piece of the sacred teaching. The forest had taught them that permanence was not rigidity, but adaptation, the silent, slow bending that allowed the root to survive the storm that fells the branch. As the years passed and the shadow of the metal legions grew longer across the plains, Lugan himself grew older, his hair turning the pale white of bleached bone, his eyes holding the soft, filtered light of the canopy. He spent his final days not preaching or instructing, but simply sitting beneath Derry, the great oak, breathing in the quiet air, allowing his mortal life to merge back into the profound, patient stillness he had sought so many decades earlier. He died as he had lived, in his wisdom, without fanfare, without fear, simply completing his cycle and becoming, once again, the rich soil beneath the sacred tree. And so the Nemeton continues its perpetual work, a place of quiet refuge and profound instruction, reminding all who seek its shelter that true wisdom is found not in seeking answers, but in learning to listen to the slow, relentless rhythm of the earth. The spirits of the ancient Druids remain woven into the fabric of the forest, moving in the whisper of the wind through the topmost leaves and in the silent, inexorable stretching of the deepest roots, ensuring that the great, calm narrative of the natural world will continue long after the fleeting noise of men has faded entirely. May your own journey toward rest be as deep and as peaceful as the heartwood of the ancient oak. The mantle of the Nemeton did not pass to the loudest voice or the swiftest foot, but settled instead upon the shoulders of Elder Sion, a man whose presence was as quiet and deeply rooted as Luhan's own, yet who carried a new, subtle apprehension in the set of his jaw. He understood that the greatest challenge was not to replicate the wisdom of the past master, but to maintain the absolute integrity of the sacred space when the surrounding world seemed intent on fracturing into fearful chaos and desperate, aggressive noise. Sion walked the winding paths daily, measuring the health of the young saplings and the resilience of the old growth, finding assurance in the forest's steadfast refusal to rush its vital processes, offering silent prayers that the human spirit might learn the same quiet patience. The weight of the people's hidden anxieties pressed down upon the canopy, making the very air feel thicker and heavier than it had in the time of undisputed peace, testing the boundaries of the spiritual sanctuary. From the edges of the sacred territory, where the wild wood yielded to the open grazing lands, the distant sounds of marching often drifted in, faint at first, like the buzzing of a trapped beetle, but growing steadily more insistent with the passing of each moon. Young initiates, sent out to gather certain medicinal mosses and to observe the movements of the stars, returned with tales of straightened roads laid across ancient meadows and of great palisades hammered together with cold iron, marking the territory of those who understood only conquest and boundary. These reports brought a restless energy even to the deepest heartwood, causing some of the younger Druids to speak of defiance and resistance, arguing that the wisdom of the earth must be defended with the strength of the arm, lest the deep teaching be buried entirely beneath foreign dust. Cian listened to their impassioned, fearful rhetoric with the same steady calm he reserved for reading the omens in the shifting smoke of the sacred fire, recognizing that fear itself was the greatest external force threatening their peace. Among the disciples was Aemon, a man of strong hands and a heart that felt the suffering of the tribes acutely, who struggled to reconcile Luhan's absolute reverence for stillness with the urgent necessity of worldly protection. He respected the quiet instruction of the roots, recognizing the power held in patience. Yet he could not shake the image of the encroaching legions, metallic and relentless, threatening to cut down the very trees that sheltered their knowledge and history. Aemon often stood at the threshold of the nematon, gazing outward where the golden light of the setting sun caught the glint of distant Forman weaponry, debating whether true duty lay in fortifying the spiritual fortress or in teaching the people how to fight their worldly battles. He prayed that the gods of the grove would grant him clarity, for the way of non-action felt perilously close to the way of surrender, and the future of their sacred tradition seemed balanced precariously upon his hesitation. Seeking counsel beyond the silent, enduring trees, Aemon traveled westward until he reached the banks of the mighty river that carved its ceaseless path toward the cold sea, believing that the moving water held a different, more dynamic kind of truth than the static earth. He watched how the river flowed around every obstacle, the jutting rock, the fallen log, never pausing, never becoming hardened, yet exerting a persistent force that could eventually shape the toughest granite into smooth pebbles over eons of time. The lesson the river imparted was neither complete defiance nor complete yielding, but rather the art of continuous movement and adaptation, retaining one's essence while utilizing the path of least resistance to continue the eternal journey. This quiet, liquid wisdom suggested that perhaps the resistance required by the moment was not the clash of swords, but the unyielding flow of culture, knowledge, and memory, carrying the sacred essence beyond the reach of any temporary human empire. Returning to the nematon, Aemon began to work tirelessly, not with weaponry or tactics, but with the meticulous collection and codification of their ancestral wisdom, determined that if the physical forests fell, the forests of the mind would remain unmolested and alive. He transcribed the vast oral history of the tribes onto thin sheets of prepared bark and finely woven linen, documenting the constellations, the intricate medicinal properties of the smallest fungi, and the complex patterns of the ancient hymns that spoke of the creation of the world. This became a sacred labor of preservation, ensuring that the rhythm and cadence of the Druidic teaching, which relied upon memory and accurate repetition, would survive the coming darkness, becoming seeds ready to sprout again in any land where freedom might eventually return. Chion watched him with approval, understanding that Aemon had found the perfect balance between the stillness of the heartwood and the necessary preparedness for change, transforming his earlier anxiety into resolute diligence. The Council of Druids, guided by Cian's steady hand and Aemon's practical foresight, decided that their focus must shift entirely from public ritual to the absolute protection of the profound inner mysteries, allowing the outer appearance of their faith to diminish for a season. They began holding their most sacred rites in the deepest caves beneath the roots of the ancient oaks, transferring the light of their teaching into hidden earthen vessels that could not be easily shattered by the trampling feet of invaders seeking easily discernible shrines. They taught the remaining tribes that the true sanctuary was not the ring of visible stones or the open clearing, but the unwavering integrity found within the human spirit, a sacred chamber that no legion could ever breach or successfully map. This retreat into the silent depths was a strategy of temporal preservation, a patient, long-term sacrifice of immediate presence for the sake of eventual, certain revival, mirroring the necessary hibernation of the seeds in the cold winter earth awaiting the return of spring. Cian knew that the time for open sanctuary was drawing to a close, and one twilight he went alone to the great oak, Derry, which had sheltered Luhan and countless generations before him, to offer a final, somber communion and farewell. He placed his hand upon the bark, feeling the slow, deep heartbeat of the wood, acknowledging the painful possibility that this mighty vessel of life might soon fall victim to the axe wielded by men who saw only timber and fuel, not spirit and profound wisdom. He asked the tree not for protection for himself or his followers, but for the endurance of the memory of its shadow, praying that the essence of the nematon might diffuse into the very air and the running water, carried to the distant places where the tribes were slowly retreating, ensuring that the spiritual map would never be entirely lost. The silence of the ancient grove offered no spoken reassurance, only the profound, steady acceptance of its own inevitable cyclical transformation, reinforcing the oldest lesson: but even the greatest, most enduring structures must eventually yield their form to the eternal flow of being. The younger generation, those who had known only the shadow of Rome on the horizon, were tasked with becoming the living libraries, the moving nemetons, each carrying within their breath and memory a fragment of the great wisdom, ready to be passed on in whispers. They were dispersed, traveling under the guise of healers, bards, and common tradesmen, weaving the complex patterns of prophecy and history into simple, memorable songs and innocuous tales that the common folk could carry without raising suspicion. This dispersal was not a scattering in defeat, but a careful transplantation of vital cuttings, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual life of the land would continue its subtle growth even beneath the hard pavement of foreign dominion. Amon oversaw this delicate network of memory keepers, understanding that the true power of the Druids lay not in their visible authority, but in their ability to make the most profound truths so simple that they became invisible and inseparable from the everyday actions of the people. The final ritual, held within the open clearing of the Nemeton, was conducted beneath a sky so heavy with cloud that the stars were completely obscured, save for the flickering light of the single, carefully guarded sacred fire. Sion spoke low, his voice barely rising above the rustle of the dry autumn leaves, reminding those gathered that darkness does not extinguish light, but rather makes the remaining light appear more intense and precious. They purified the central altar stone, covering it not with garlands, but with thick, dark earth, entrusting it to the patience of the ground, knowing that the soil would guard it until the age of iron had rusted away and the time for remembrance had finally arrived. Then, one by one, the Druids extinguished their individual torches and turned their backs on the familiar sanctuary, walking silently into the woods to begin their long pilgrimage into the heart of the resistance, which was not a battle, but a vast and slow undertaking of forgetting to forget. Elder Sion himself remained, choosing to be the last vessel of the Nemeton's direct presence, watching the shadows of his colleagues fade into the trees, preparing to receive the final wave of the encroaching world with quiet dignity. He knew his sacrifice was necessary, for the invaders would seek a center to destroy, and if they found the center occupied by only one ancient, surrendered man, they might be momentarily satisfied and overlook the many seeds already sown beyond the boundaries. His task was to absorb the initial violence of the change, drawing the focus upon himself so that the quiet stream of knowledge could continue to flow unseen beneath the surface of the imposed peace, protecting the deep truth of the oak. He sat down at the foot of Derry, closing his eyes, listening to the soft, distant ring of the approaching hammers, transforming the sound of destruction into a meditative rhythm, awaiting the unavoidable meeting between stillness and force. The first foreign soldiers to breach the boundary of the Nemeton found not a fortress of defiance or a hidden gathering of armed men, but a clearing strangely empty, save for the profound, silent presence of the massive oak and one solitary old man sitting peacefully beneath its vast shadow. They saw the remnants of the cold fire, the freshly buried stones, and the lack of any gold or wealth, finding nothing that satisfied their expectation of a pagan stronghold ripe for plunder or immediate subjugation. When they questioned Sion, demanding to know the whereabouts of his followers and the location of the great treasures, he simply opened his eyes, which held the same filtered green light that Lugon's had, and pointed to the surrounding forest, indicating that the treasures were the light, the soil, and the breath of the ancient trees themselves. His answers were truthful yet deeply evasive, rooted in a wisdom they could not translate, offering only riddles of nature to their questions of geography and power. Frustrated by the spiritual poverty of the place and the quiet, unmoving resistance of the old druid, the commander ordered the great oak dairy to be felled, believing that the destruction of the central symbol would break the spirit of the lingering people and teach a lasting lesson in submission. The metallic sound of the axis began, a jarring, rapid percussion that shattered the profound silence of the grove, a sound fundamentally alien to the natural rhythms of the nemetom, marking the true entrance of the Age of Iron into the heart of the spiritual sanctuary. Sion did not flinch, nor did he cry out in despair. He remained seated, continuing his silent meditation, observing the frantic, hurried effort of the soldiers as they worked to destroy something that had taken 1,000 years merely to rise to its current height. He watched the great, vital trunk split and groan, knowing that even in its death, Derry was performing its final, greatest instruction, teaching the necessity of letting go of the physical form when the spirit has already flown to safety. When the massive oak finally crashed down with a sound that shook the very foundation of the earth, silencing the birds for miles and scattering the startled deer, Sion felt the momentary darkness as the canopy was ripped open to the harsh glare of the sky. The ancient root structure, however, remained embedded deep within the earth, a vast, resilient network that the axes could not easily touch, maintaining its slow, silent connection to the underground springs and the sleeping seeds of future forests. The old druid closed his eyes for the last time, his body settling against the newly exposed earth, absorbing the shock of the tree's fall. And, in that same moment, a profound sense of lightness flowed through the entire hidden network of dispersed druids across the island. They felt the death of the sacred center as a profound wave of transition, not an ending, understanding that the true Nemeton had now fully moved from a physical location to reside entirely within the realm of collective memory and the inviolable spirit of the land itself. The soldiers left the scene quickly, taking the great timbers with them, leaving behind a scarred and broken clearing, believing they had extinguished the source of native defiance and philosophical strength, satisfied with the visible evidence of their conquest. They did not understand, but the Nemeton was not the timber, nor the clearing, nor the ring of stones, but the enduring understanding of cyclical time, the patience of the seed, and the relentless subterranean life of the severed roots. For years afterward, a few hardy initiates, guided by the almost supernatural persistence of memory, would return secretly to the scar left by Derry, whispering the old chants into the broken soil, believing that the spirit of the oak lingered in the fragments of the root system, awaiting the opportunity to sprout again. They watched patiently as the ferns began to colonize the exposed earth, and the smaller shrubs hesitantly pushed their way through the broken ground, recognizing in this quiet, slow reclamation the living promise of the forest's ultimate triumph over any fleeting violence wrought by men and their metal tools. The true work of the Druids, then, became an exercise in temporal faith, maintaining the fire of wisdom not in roaring bonfires, but in the small, steady flame of the hearth and the quiet, repetitive rhythm of the loom, weaving ancient symbols into mundane cloth. The bards, who were the public voice of the hidden order, ensured that every legend of warrior triumph or sorrowful defeat contained a subtle, hidden lesson about the resilience of the earth or the necessity of inner silence, passing the deep teaching disguised within the simple narrative entertainment. The Druids have learned that to survive an age of overwhelming force, one must become both entirely adaptable, like the flowing water, and entirely unmoving in essence, like the deeply buried quartz crystal, reflecting a light that only those truly seeking truth could perceive. This subtle, pervasive resistance allowed the sacred consciousness of the land to persist, blending seamlessly into the background noise of the occupying force, a profound spiritual camouflage that protected the fragile growth of future freedom. The memory of Lugan and Kian became interwoven into the lore of the deepest woods, not as figures of unattainable perfection, but as teachers who demonstrated that true power lay in completion, in knowing when to transition from action to stillness, from presence to memory, from the upright form to the fertile, enriching soil. Their stories taught that the purpose of the nematon was not to withstand every storm, but to ensure that the vital wisdom survived the inevitable devastation, ready to instruct the generations that would eventually emerge into the sunlight of a renewed era. The vast network of knowledge continued to flow like the underground river, sustaining the tribes through their long, wearying subjugation, reminding them always that the transient noise of empire could never truly silence the deep, patient rhythm of the turning earth and the enduring truth of the stars above. The slow passing of generations under the weight of the eagle standards meant that the fire of the ancestral faith had to be drawn inward, banked deep beneath the ashes of daily subservience, lest the slightest plume of smoke betray the hidden warmth to the watchful centurions who patrolled the newly cut military roads. Emir, the granddaughter of those who remembered Lugan's final instruction, understood that the nematon was no longer a towering grove of inviolable oaks, but the very curve of the clay pot she shaped upon the wheel, or the intricate knotting of the woolen shawl destined for the market. Her hands, skilled in the mundane tasks of the subjugated settlement, moved with a silent, ritualistic precision, ensuring that the necessary truths were preserved not in loud proclamation, but in the enduring structure and concealed geometry of common life, waiting for the time when the outer world was ready to receive them once more. The language of the trees and the stars, once spoken freely around the roaring communal fires, had become the language of the loom. Every warp and weft held a deliberate meaning, known only to those initiated into the craft of subtle resistance. And the shade of the indigo dye, or the spacing of the crimson thread, could signify the movement of distant cohorts or the location of a hidden gathering place deep within the marshlands where the legions dared not tread. She learned to read the patterns etched upon the lintels of the oldest homes, geometric signs that appeared to be simple decoration, yet functioned as a complex calendar, charting the sacred festivals that could no longer be openly celebrated, marking the turning of the wheel beneath the gaze of foreign gods and imported Roman celebrations. Through this silent communication, the scattered remnants of the tribes remained bound by an invisible cord of shared understanding, a profound unity woven into the very fabric of their weary existence, unseen by the masters who only perceived simple goods ready for heavy taxation. The greatest danger lay not in open rebellion, which was futile and swiftly crushed with overwhelming force, but in the careless slip of the tongue or the too intense focus in the eye, for the occupying forces employed their own methods of quiet observation, seeking out the lingering spark of defiant spirit they could not extinguish entirely with mere steel and concrete. Near the central well, where the Roman soldiers gathered often for water and talk, stood a massive, worn piece of sandstone used centuries ago for grinding grain, now merely a resting place for weary travelers and market women, which was known secretly amongst the keepers as the Stone of Whispers. Here, Emar would sit, ostensibly resting or waiting for a customer to examine her wares, but in truth she was listening to the rhythms of the stone, placing her hand upon its cold, ancient surface to feel the subtle vibrations left by the coded touch of others who had passed moments before, leaving behind instructions hidden within the language of common complaint or hurried farewell. Though the great libraries of inscribed wooden tablets had long been burned or scattered to the winds, Replaced by the Roman census and scroll, the knowledge itself was not lost, dwelling instead within the sharp, patient mind of Elder Gareth, who lived quietly as a basket weaver near the edge of the settlement, feigning a convenient deafness toward the constant demands of the provincial governors and the shouting of the tax collectors. Gareth was the living repository of the ancient genealogies, the complex laws of the land, and the medicinal properties of every root and berry found on the hillsides, preserving this vast, fluid library by encoding it into the rhythm of his daily labor, speaking the truths aloud only when surrounded by the rustling cover of the reeds or the incessant chatter of his own market trade. To Amir, he entrusted the continuation of the vital oral chain, instructing her not merely on what specific rituals to memorize, but on how to forget the unimportant accretions of the past, retaining only the vital architecture of belief, the immutable framework upon which all future restoration would fundamentally depend. The slow erosion of identity proved a far more insidious enemy than the clash of steel upon shield, for the Roman governors were clever enough to offer certain comforts and conveniences, paved roads that sped trade, structured law courts, and the occasional grant of partial citizenship that tempted the younger generations to let go of the arduous, dangerous discipline of the old ways of the Nemeton. Many found it easier and safer to adopt the language and the deities of the conquerors, blending their own gods into the vast, impersonal pantheon of Rome, believing they were achieving peace when they were merely achieving quiet, generational resignation. This creeping assimilation threatened to sever the vital spiritual connection between the people and the land itself, threatening to silence the deep, patient rhythm of the turning earth, which was the true source of their enduring strength, reducing the profound Nemeton War to quaint, superstitious tales told only by the very old, unfit for the new, modern world. Yet, when the year turned toward the deep silence of Samhain, the ancient urge for communion with the veil between worlds could not be entirely suppressed, and under the darkest cloak of the new moon, small gatherings would occur far from the beaten tracks, in places where the memory of the original Nemeton still resonated powerfully within the moss-covered, forgotten stones. These were not the vibrant, fire-lit festivals of the free ancestors, where great herds were offered and feasting lasted for days, but hushed, secretive meetings where the names of the departed were whispered into the night air with deep reverence, and small offerings of harvested grain and sweet water were placed upon unmarked burial mounds, reaffirming the sacred contract between the living and those who had gone before into the other world. Emar would carry the necessary embers from Gareth's hearth, transporting the last remaining spark of the lineage of the sacred fire, a tiny glowing symbol that, despite the overwhelming darkness of the age, the light of the inner teaching had not been extinguished, only profoundly and carefully contained. The Druidic philosophy taught that boundaries were permeable, necessary structures, but never ultimate prisons designed to hold the spirit, and this understanding became crucial for survival. They learned to recognize the truth that lay hidden even within the rigorous Roman worldview, respecting the practical organization and the structure of their efficient laws, while fiercely guarding the spiritual core that the invaders could never truly comprehend or conquer with their material might. They viewed the massive empire as merely another phase of the turning cycle, a powerful, extensive winter that would eventually exhaust its own force and retreat inward, leaving the underlying soil prepared for the eventual reemergence of the indigenous growth when the time of thaw arrived naturally. This long perspective, anchored in the patient cycle of the seasons, provided a depth of endurance that was incomprehensible to the quick-moving, transactional Roman mind, granting the subjugated people a quiet, eternal resilience derived from the certainty of cosmic repetition and the guaranteed renewal of the spirit. Even those who lived daily within the stone walls of the newly established towns and forts found their spirits returning each night to the dark, untamed edge of the forests and the deep hills, the places the Romans feared and deliberately avoided, for it was here that the oldest, untamed energies still pulsed unhindered by the measured cadence of marching legions and the geometric rigidity of the camps. The deepest guidance for their silent resistance came through the pathways of sleep, where the minds of the initiated were taught to traverse the boundaries between the realms of the living and the dead, seeking counsel not from compromised living elders, but from the spirits of the deep earth and the ancestors who dwelt eternally among the roots of the mightiest, oldest oaks. Ymir and her peers relied upon the interpretation of shared dreams, carefully gathering the fragmented visions into a cohesive picture of warning or encouragement, a map of the internal landscape that mirrored the enduring geography of the sacred land itself, preserving the true sovereignty of the spirit within. Every tool was therefore consecrated through its simple and necessary use. The humble spade used to turn the hard, Roman-taxed soil was also the instrument that drew the sacred geomantic lines of protection around the home. The heavy mortar used for grinding grains became the altar upon which small, silent acts of reverence were performed before the meal was consumed and shared among the family. This insistence upon the spiritual integrity of the mundane transformed the experience of subjugation, proving that holiness was not restricted to the great, public nematon spaces now denied to them, but permeated every moment, every object touched by human hand, maintaining the continuous, sacred connection that the imperial oversight could never fully police or suppress through law or force. This quiet, unbroken devotion became the final, strongest shield of the Celtic heart, a form of resistance that was invisible precisely because it was entirely pervasive, woven into the very fiber of their breathing and working lives, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the noise of occupation. The keepers understood that their duty was not necessarily to witness the end of the long dark night, for the age of iron was vast and slow in its recession, but merely to ensure that the vital spark of the spiritual sun survived the painful transition, ensuring that the wisdom passed down from Luhan and Cian did not become distorted into mere folklore or fade entirely into silence under the overwhelming weight of foreign influence. They prepared the soil for a dawn they might never see in their own lifetimes, knowing that the greatest gift they could offer the future generations was the pure, untainted memory of what it meant to stand deeply rooted in the native earth, upholding the truth that the nematon was ultimately carried not in stone or wood, nor in the grand architecture of lost temples, but in the unwavering, deep beat of the human heart, synchronized perfectly with the ancient, patient rhythm of the planet and the turning of the heavenly spheres. The teaching flowed into the new bards, who were now merely traveling potters and traders, adapting their verses to the market square, where riddles about the strength of the 9 waves and the resilience of the hazelnut became the carriers of cosmological truths that the Roman ears dismissed as quaint rural poetry, oblivious to the subversive, enduring power of the knowledge held within the deceptively simple rhyme. The deep silence of the preserved wisdom was its greatest defense, a vast reservoir of patience that spanned centuries, waiting for the momentary tempest of empire to spend its fury upon the coastal shores, knowing that the roots of the forest grew deepest precisely during the long, quiet winter, gathering strength beneath the frozen surface. Ymir learned to use the Roman fascination with order against them, employing their own systems of record-keeping and travel permits to mask her movements between the scattered families who held fragments of the lore, ensuring the scattered network remained robust and interconnected despite the vast distances and the constant threat of surveillance. She moved like the shadow of a cloud across the landscape, perceived but never truly grasped, a woman of the common people whose mind held the complexity of the stars and the unwritten laws of the most ancient kings. The humble clay, fired hard in Ymar's small, inconspicuous kiln, became her silent ally and her most reliable messenger. For while the Romans cared only for the tax rolls and the uniformity of traded goods, they never truly looked into the whirls of the glaze or the pattern pressed deeply into the base of a common amphora. She perfected the art of the encoded vessel, where the placement of 9 specific depressions represented the ninefold mystery of the soul's journey, and a certain curve in the handle, seemingly a simple ergonomic choice, mimicked the trajectory of the moon around the Earth, communicating the date and location of the next clandestine gathering to those who possessed the knowing eye. This commerce provided the necessary cover for her journeys, affording her official documents that listed her as a purveyor of necessary household wares, enabling her to pass the garrisons with a polite, weary nod that suggested nothing more than a desire to earn a few meager coins before nightfall overtook the road. One cold spring, Ymir found herself detained briefly at a newly constructed stone fort, where the garrison was commanded by Prefect Lucius Valerius, a man known not for cruelty, but for a meticulously ordered mind that considered chaos the greatest enemy of civilization, viewing the native traditions as merely untidy clutter that needed to be swept away for the sake of efficient governance. Lucius demanded to see the contents of her cart, not out of suspicion of rebellion, but in a precise audit of weights and measurements, ensuring that the tariffs levied were exact to the ounce, a bureaucratic exercise Ymir met with unwavering calm and a practiced deference that mirrored his own obsession with detail. She allowed him to measure the height of every stack of bowls and count every spindle whorl, knowing that the exhaustive focus on the material tally successfully blinded him to the non-material treasure she carried: 3 crucial verses of the great ancestor song memorized just that morning from an old woman near the headwaters of the Severn. Lucius, satisfied by the orderliness of her manifest and impressed by the quality of her plain, durable wares, which were, he noted, far superior to the mass-produced pottery arriving from Gaul, stamped her papers with a heavy finality, believing he had dismissed a harmless, industrious local woman, entirely unaware that the pattern of faint scratches left upon the bottom edge of the stamp mark was a subtle ogham indicator designating the safe house for the winter solstice meeting. The greatest challenge was not dodging the aggressive patrols, but navigating the administrative labyrinth the Romans had erected, transforming the wild landscapes of her youth into a grid of regulated paths. But Ymir taught the scattered network that true freedom lay in mastering this imposed geometry, moving along the lines of least resistance, like water flowing through cracks in pavement. She utilized the Roman system of postal routes intended for official communication, finding small, overlooked spaces where a carefully placed stone or a distinct cluster of moss communicated news faster and safer than any spoken word, ensuring the continuity of the fragmented colleges. The few remaining practitioners of the high lore could no longer assemble in the sacred groves, which had mostly been felled for timber or repurposed as sites for Roman temples dedicated to Jupiter and Mars, so their meetings shifted to the liminal spaces that the occupying forces either feared or ignored, places where the very nature of the land resisted definitive ownership. They began to meet primarily in the deep, water-eroded caves near the coast, where the roaring sound of the tides acted as an encompassing acoustic curtain, muffling their quiet recitations from any eavesdropping ears, the damp stone walls themselves becoming the new surfaces upon which the ancient knowledge was imprinted through memory and recitation. Here, huddled around a single oil lamp whose flickering light cast vast, dancing shadows, Ymir would share the latest fragment of the ancestral lore she had managed to gather, weaving together the verses concerning the relationship between the 3 cauldrons of poetic inspiration and the cycles of cosmic manifestation. Here, huddled around a single oil lamp whose flickering light cast vast dancing shadows, Emer would share the latest fragment of the ancestral lore she had managed to gather, weaving together the verses concerning the relationship between the three cauldrons of poetic inspiration and the cycles of cosmic manifestation. She realized quickly that the young apprentices, born under the shadow of the Eagle Standard, struggled deeply with the abstract, sweeping cosmologies of the pure Druidic tradition, their minds being more accustomed to the hard, measurable reality of Roman roads and minted coins. So the delivery of the sacred teachings had to become intensely practical and immediate. Emir taught them the secret names of the rivers not by rote memorization in a silent room, but by requiring them to manage the precise logistics of a trade route dependent on those rivers, linking the spiritual geography directly to the mundane necessities of survival and commerce, thus ensuring that the physical landscape remained mapped by ancient knowledge, even if the official maps carried Latin names. The old riddles about the strength of the 9 waves were now employed to calculate the stability of a boat or the timing of a crossing, transforming metaphysical queries into practical maritime survival skills, grounding the abstract truth firmly within the sphere of everyday life. The greatest fear of the elders was not the extinction of the Druids themselves, but the loss of the lineage of understanding, the thread that connected the current fragmented knowledge back to the unified wisdom held before the invasion, a truth that transcended mere facts and required a living link to maintain its power. Emar was tasked with securing the continuity of the historical memory, which involved secretly transporting the sacred genealogies and the laws of the pre-Roman kings, truths that the empire desperately wanted erased, knowing that their mere existence challenged the legitimacy of the provincial governors. This immense burden of history was not placed upon heavy scrolls, which were too easily seized, but rather meticulously encoded within the complex weaving patterns of ceremonial blankets and tapestries, utilizing the count of knots and the arrangement of colors to hold the entirety of the tribal succession and legal precedent. This immense burden of history was not placed upon heavy scrolls, which were too easily seized, but rather meticulously encoded within the complex weaving patterns of ceremonial blankets and tapestries, utilizing the count of knots and the arrangement of colors to hold the entirety of the tribal succession and legal precedent. To move this precious historical matrix, she presented the tapestry as a common, if highly decorative, bed covering intended for sale to a wealthy Roman collaborator in the South, banking on the Roman tendency to admire and collect native craftsmanship while remaining utterly blind to its deep underlying structure and meaning. Traveling further south meant penetrating deeper into the heart of Roman provincial control, where the native tongue was seldom heard, and the influence of the Latin god Mithras was beginning to eclipse the old woodland deities, making every conversation a linguistic tightrope walk between necessary communication and revealing too much of the core identity. Emir adopted the mannerisms and dress of a sophisticated, highly successful trader, a difficult role to maintain, but one that afforded her privileges and access that a simple countrywoman would never have been granted, demonstrating that the preservation of truth sometimes required donning the most elaborate and deceptive mask. The challenge was made greater by the Roman practice of the census, a relentless effort to count, categorize, and tax every single soul, fixing their location and identity rigidly within the imperial database. But Emer utilized this very system to protect the most vulnerable keepers of the lore, the few remaining women who held the critical knowledge of healing and prophecy. She arranged for key figures to be strategically registered multiple times under slightly varying names, or sometimes deliberately omitted entirely from certain parish counts, ensuring that when the inevitable official purges or mass relocations occurred, the vital thread of knowledge was never concentrated in one spot, but was instead distributed and thus capable of surviving multiple administrative strikes. This strategy required intimate knowledge of the petty rivalries and clerical errors within the Roman administration, turning their weaknesses for vanity and confusion into a shield for the enduring traditions of her people. The true work of the Druid now became the constant, subtle re-sanctification of the mundane, ensuring that even within the confines of a marketplace built by Roman engineers, the cycles of the sun and the moon were honored through the timing of transactions and the specific placement of goods upon the stalls. They marked the turning points of the year, the great festivals of Beltane and Samhain, not with roaring bonfires visible for miles, but with small personal acts, the precise kindling of a cooking fire, the silent offering of a single cup of fresh milk poured onto the roots of a wild-growing hawthorn bush at midnight, invisible rituals that maintained the connection to the earth without attracting the violent attention of the legionaries. Eomer understood that the vast, intimidating structures of the Roman Empire were built upon a fragile foundation of physical presence, while the Druidic world, now residing in the heart and the memory, possessed the infinite strength of non-presence, enduring where stone monuments eventually crumble. She began instructing the younger generation, those who would become the bards of the next age, in the art of deep listening, teaching them that the true grove was not the clearing they had lost, but the quiet space found between the words of the conquerors, the moment of silence before the striking of the blacksmith's hammer, and the whispering language of the running stream that flowed beneath the heavy stone bridges of the empire. The ancient texts, which spoke of the three realms of land, sea, and sky, were now interpreted through the lens of Roman occupation, where the land represented the subjugated territory, the sea represented the infinite escape route and the source of uncontrollable power, and the sky represented the unchanging eternal laws that transcended temporary human rule. Through this constant reinterpretation, the knowledge remained alive, dynamic, and ever relevant to the immediate spiritual struggle for cultural survival against an enemy defined by iron and straight lines. Eomer knew that the greatest gift she could pass on was not the entirety of the ancient lore, which was too vast and fragmented to be fully recovered in this generation, but rather the spirit of continuity. The fierce, unyielding belief in the inevitable return of the deep, cyclical order after the passing of this sharp, violent epoch. She continued her travels, her cart laden with mundane pots and plain linen, yet carrying within her heart the secret map of the unwritten territory, the hidden rivers of sacred thought that still fed the roots of the forest, waiting patiently beneath the hard, polished veneer of the imperial road. Her journeys took her further east, towards the distant garrisons near the edge of the known world, where the Roman influence began to thin, and where she hoped to find the last true hermits of the old colleges, men who had retreated entirely from the colonized lands, and who might still hold the keys to the ritual calendar long thought lost.